It's interesting could be interesting for German policymakers, since right now there's just another reform of this German inheritance and gift taxation in the planning. And I think especially this new field of empirical research can, in general, not my thesis especially, but in general, empirical research can contribute really significantly to policy making and to bring new insights in how policies should be shaped. Like a financial ministry, the federal financial ministry, who is in charge of designing this kind of reforms. But otherwise, it is also super interesting in general for this whole field of behavioral responses to wealth transfer taxation, because overall there's not a lot of research done so far to these kind of taxations.
Practice institution, the World Bank, and I think it will be interesting from the World Bank or organizations that work in corruption itself, because for the last year there's been like a booming on promoting the introduction of regulation against corruption, but this again has a positive impact, but it's very small. So it's important, of course, but it also needs to go along with other policies. So I guess being aware of this is relevant in the development field. Cool.
I think my findings are relevant for government, like practitioners, as well as international organizations working within a country. The main actors are sort of those in control at the moment, which are mainly the
for the Mexican government, right? But more specifically for the collection agency, because then since collection or tax to firms is an important part of taxation in Mexico, they could tailor specific strategies to increase tax morale in the private sector or tax morale of firms and increase collection overall.
Yes, I think they are relevant, but what I failed to achieve was to find the causal mechanisms by which political ideology translates into better health outcomes. So I think that somebody else or future researchers can actually delve into that issue and find the relationship and how it operationalizes in reality.
Okay.
The findings are relevant for people who want to improve policy making, both sides of the aisle actually, so both policymakers and also industry, because my findings don't say that the energy turnaround is either bad or good. It just says that they are not the whole transition is not being done in an optimal way. So there's a lot of wasted resources, and this is really relevant for companies because they want to pay less for reducing emissions, but they're willing to if it's done in an economic way. And it's really relevant for policymakers because businesses are more likely to comply with the policies they think of if they are sort of done in a sensible way that can maybe even render economic benefits.
Okay.
Explicitly targeted a school board in Washington, D.C., and I wanted to make it both complex enough that it is interesting, but simple enough that a member of the school board or a teacher could read the analysis and understand what future studies should be conducted or where they could improve education.
Okay.
Yeah.
I would hope for policymakers on the federal level, because they were the ones that initiated the EID, so I would hope that they would rethink their communication strategy and maybe think about how they could bring the EID closer to the people.
Okay.
Some relevance for humanitarian policymakers. The main organization working in the two countries where I conducted the case studies is the UNHCR, so that's the High Commissioner for Refugees. But there's a lot of implementing partners, smaller humanitarian organizations that work on this. And there's, of course, the local governments, both at the central level, but more importantly at the local level, because a lot of the municipalities where housing in urban areas affected by refugees is an issue need support, funding, and capacity training to better improve their responses.
Okay. I personally believe that the people that would find it most relevant and interesting are the people that live in these communities themselves, the asentados, and the social movement that the vast majority of them were a part of or were even militant in the past when these communities were created, called MST. And beyond them, the Brazilian Institute for Agrarian Reform, the INCRA, and the associated actors in the Brazilian political system could find it relevant and interesting. And basically then anyone interested in agrarian reform processes in the Global South, but specifically in Latin America, that shares, out of my experience of the case, many of the structural features of the Brazilian case, would definitely find it relevant to have a look at what we found.
Okay.
Feel in the specific area, but also maybe to people in the country, maybe bureaucrats in the country, civil servants, just to see, okay, what's still going on.
I did my internship at the Chancellery for Cultural Affairs, and that's where I started to thinking of where to go and who could be my main audience. So this public sector, administration, cultural affairs department is somehow my main. I think it could be relevant for the other stakeholders involved in the policy-making process, for example, the cultural scene, the administration, as I already mentioned, but also the tourism scene that is engaged in one particular policy that I'm feeling. And yeah.
Well, policymakers, definitely. So in the US, there's a debate going on whether or not like energy exports, I was focusing particularly on natural gas exports, should be allowed, or that a significant amount of exports should be allowed, and for the policymakers making or taking those decisions, yeah, it could be interesting, but again, well, the thesis remained vague, so if I was a policymaker, I wouldn't rely too much on it, but...